Welcome to the Culture Bunkin. I took all my stuff down earlier to do a podcast off-site at Baskerville Manor in Columbus, Mississippi, with Shannon Evans of Tom Bigby Tales. So I haven't put it all back yet, but I was experimenting with another sort of setup. So this is that setup, and I'm just going to see if it's more comfortable for me. I'm going to read out of a physical book tonight. Jane Austen, Complete Works, given to me by my dear friend Nick Tuckett in the UK. Big Jane Austen fan himself. Hopefully have him on the podcast in November. And we'll talk about stage plays because he's a great aficionado of stage. And he's also a rugby player and a jiu-jitsu expert and owns some gyms. So he's kind of a Renaissance man, you might say. And yeah. So here goes. Chapter 16. The hair was curled and the maid sent away, and Emma sat down to think and be miserable. It was a wretched business indeed. Such an overthrow of everything she had been wishing for. Such a development of everything most unwelcome. Such a blow for Harriet. That was the worst of all. Every part of it brought pain and humiliation of some sort or other. But compared with the evil to Harriet, but compared with the evil to Harriet, all was light, and she could gladly have submitted to feel yet more mistaken, more in error, more disgraced by misjudgment than she actually was, could the effects of her blunders have been confined to herself. If I had not persuaded Harriet into liking the man, I could have borne anything. He might have doubled his presumption to me. But poor Harriet, how could she have been so deceived? He protested that he had never thought seriously of Harriet. Never. She looked back as well as she could, but it was all confusion. She had taken up the idea, she supposed, and made everything bend to it. His manners, however, must have been unmarked, wavering, dubious. His manners, however, must have been unmarked, wavering, dubious, or she never could have been so misled. The picture. How eager he had been about the picture and the charade and 100 other circumstances. How clearly they had seemed to point at Harriet. To be sure, the charade with its ready wit, but then the soft eyes. In fact, it suited neither. It was a jumble without taste or truth. Who could have seen through such thick-headed nonsense? Certainly she had often, especially of late, thought his manners to herself unnecessarily gallant. But it had passed as his way, and as a mere error of judgment, of knowledge, of taste, as one proof, among others, that he had not always lived in the best society. That, with all the gentleness of his address, true elegance was sometimes wanting. But till this very day she had never for an instant suspected to mean anything but grateful respect to her as Harriet's friend. Good evening. Hope you're very well, whether you're live or catching the replay. If you like classic literature, this is a place for you. I hope you'll subscribe. See you back here more often. To Mr. John Knightley, was she indebted for her first idea on the subject, for the first start of its possibility. There was no denying that those brothers had penetration. She remembered what Mr. Knightley had told her once about Mr. Elton. She remembered what Mr. Knightley had once told her about Mr. Elton. She remembered what Mr. Knightley had said to her once about Mr. Elton, the caution he had given, the conviction he had professed, that Mr. Elton would never marry indiscreetly, and blushed to think how much truer a knowledge of his character had been there shown than she had reached herself. Get this light upon my page better. Sorry about that. Lily Martin, hey, how's it going? Favorite book? It's a great book. It is a great book. Sure is. I love this thing. Okay. The conviction he had confessed that Mr. Elton would never marry indiscreetly, and blushed to think how much truer a knowledge of his character had been there shown than any she could have reached herself. It was dreadfully mortifying. But Mr. Elton was proven himself in many respects the very reverse of what she had meant, and believed him proud, unassuming, conceited, very full of his own claims, and little concerned about the feelings of others. Contrary to the course of things, Mr. Elton's wanting to pay his addresses to her had sunk him, in her opinion. His professions and his proposals did him no service. She thought nothing of his attachment and was insulted by his hopes. He wanted to marry well, and having the arrogance to raise his eyes to her, pretended to be in love. But she was perfectly easy as to his not suffering any disappointment that need be cared for. There had been no real affection either in his language or manners. Sighs and fine words had been in abundance, but she would hardly devise any set of expressions or fancy any tone of voice less allied with real love. She need not trouble herself to pity him. He only wanted to aggrandize and enrich himself, and if Miss Woodhouse of Hartfield, the heiress of £30,000, were not quite so easily obtained as he fancied, he would soon try for Miss Somebody else with 20 or with 10. But that he should talk of encouragement, should consider her as aware of his views, accept in his attentions, meaning, in short, to marry him, to suppose himself her equal in connection or mind, look down upon her friend, so well understanding the graduations of rank below him, and be so blind to what rose above as to fancy himself showing no presumption in addressing her. It was most provoking. Perhaps it was not fair to expect him to feel how very much he was her inferior in talent and all the elegancies of mind. The very want of such equality might prevent his perception. The very want of such equality might prevent his perception of it. But he must know that in fortune and consequence she was greatly his superior. He must know that the Woodhouses had been settled for several generations at Hartfield, the younger branch of a very ancient family, and that the Eltons were nobody. The landed property of Hartfield certainly was inconsiderable, being but a short notch in the Donwell Abbey estate, to which all the rest of Highbury belonged, but their fortune, from other sources, was such as make them scarcely secondary to Donwell Abbey itself in every other kind of consequence, and the Woodhouses had long held a high place in the consideration of the neighborhood which Mr. Elton had first entered not 2 years ago, to make his way as he could, without any alliances but in trade, or anything to recommend him to notice but his situation and his civility. But he had fancied her in love with him. That evidently must have been his dependence. And after raving a little about the seeming incongruity of gentle manners and a conceited head, Emma was obliged, in common honesty, to stop and admit that her own behavior to him had been so complacent and obliging, so full of courtesy and attention, as supposing her real motive unperceived might warrant a man of ordinary observation and delicacy, like Mr. Elton, in fancying himself a very decided favorite. If she had so misinterpreted his feelings, she had little right to wonder that he, with self-interest to blind him, should have mistaken hers. The first error, and the worst, lay at her door. It was foolish, it was wrong to take so active a part in bringing any two people together. It was adventuring too far, assuming too much, making light of what ought to be serious, a trick of what ought to be simple. She was quite concerned and ashamed, and resolved to do such things no more. Here have I, said she, actually talked poor Harriet into being very much attached to this man. She might have never thought of him but for me, and certainly never would have thought of him with hope if I had not assured her of his attachment, for she is as modest and humble as I used to think him. For she is as modest and humble as I used to think him. Oh, that I'd been satisfied with persuading her not to accept. Oh, that I'd been satisfied with persuading her not to accept young Martin. There I was quite right. That was well done of me. But there I should have stopped and left the rest to time and chance. I was introducing her into good company and giving her the opportunity of pleasing someone worth having. I ought not to have attempted more. But now, poor girl, her piece is cut up for some time. I have been but half a friend to her. And if she were not to feel this disappointment so very much, I'm sure I have not an idea of anybody else who would be at all desirable for her. William Cox. Oh no, I could not endure William Cox, a pert young lawyer. She stopped to blush and laugh at her own relapse, and then resumed a more serious, more dispirited cogitation upon what had been, and might be, and must be. The distressing explanation she had to make to Harriet, and all that poor Harriet would be suffering with the awkwardness of future meetings, the difficulties of containing or discontinuing the acquaintances, of subduing feelings, concealing resentment, and avoiding eclat, were enough to occupy her in most unmirthful reflections some time longer, and she went to bed at last with nothing settled but the conviction of her having blundered most dreadfully. To youth and natural cheerfulness like Emma's, though under temporary gloom at night, the return of day will hardly fail to bring return of spirits. The youth and cheerfulness of morning are in happy analogy and of powerful operation, and if the distress be not poignant enough to keep the eyes unclosed, they will be sure to open to sensations of softened pain and brighter hope. Emma got up on the morrow more disposed for comfort than she had gone to bed, more ready to see alleviations of evil before her, and to depend on getting tolerably out of it. It was a great consolation that Mr. Elton should not be really in love with her, or so particularly amiable as to make it shocking to disappoint him. That Harriet's nature should not be of that superior sort in which the feelings are most acute and retentive, and that there could be no necessity for anybody's knowing what had passed except the three principals, and especially for her father's being given a moment's uneasiness about it. These were very cheering thoughts, and the sight of a great deal of snow on the ground did her further service, for anything was welcome that might justify their all three being quite asunder at present. The weather was most favorable for her, though Christmas Day she could not go to church. Mr. Woodhouse would have been miserable had his daughter attempted it, and she was therefore safe from either exciting or receiving unpleasant and most unsuitable ideas. The ground covered with snow, and the atmosphere, and that unsettled taste between frost and thaw, which is of all others the most unfriendly for exercise, every morning beginning in rain or snow, and every evening setting in to freeze, she was for many days a most honorable prisoner. No intercourse with Harriet possible but by note. No church for her on Sunday any more than on Christmas Day, and no need to find excuses for Mr. Elton's absenting himself. It was weather which might fairly confine everybody at home, and though she hoped and believed him to be really taking comfort in some society or other, it was very pleasant to have her father so well satisfied with his being all alone in his own house, too wise to stir out, and to hear him say to Mr. Knightley, whom no weather could keep entirely from them, "Ah, Mr. Knightley, Why don't you stay at home like poor Mr. Elton? These days of confinement would have been, but for her private perplexities, remarkably comfortable, as such seclusion exactly suited her brother, whose feelings must always be of great importance to his companions, and he had besides so thoroughly cleared off his ill humor at Randall's that his amiableness never failed him during the rest of his stay at Hartfield. He was always agreeable and obliging, and speaking pleasantly of everybody. But with all the hopes of cheerfulness and all the present comfort of delay, there was still such an evil hanging over her in the hour of explanation with Harriet as made it impossible for Emma to ever be perfectly at ease. That is chapter 16 of Emma. Might do chapter 17 as well. Let's see. Stay situated here. All right. Let me change my little banner down here. 17, okay, 17 there and there. Okay, chapter 17. Chapter 17. Mr. and Mrs. John Knightley were not detained long at Hartford. The weather soon improved enough for those to move who must move, and Mr. Woodhouse, having, as usual, tried to persuade his daughter to stay behind with all her children, was obliged to see the whole party set off. And return to his lamentations over the destiny of poor Isabella, which poor Isabella, passing her life with those she doted on, full of their merits, blind to their faults, and always innocently busy, might have been a model of right feminine happiness. The evening of the very day on which they brought The evening of the very day on which they went brought a note from Mr. Elton to Mr. Woodhouse, a long, civil, ceremonious note to say, with Mr. Elton's best compliments, that he was proposing to leave Highbury the following morning in his way to Bath, where, in compliance with the pressing entreaties of some friends, he had engaged to spend a few weeks, and very much regretted the impossibility he was under, from various circumstances of weather and business, of taking a personal leave of Mr. Woodhouse, of whose friendly civilities he should ever retain a grateful sense, and had Mr. Woodhouse any commands, should be happy to attend to them. Emma was most agreeably surprised. Mr. Elton's absence just at this time was the very thing to be desired. She admired him for contriving it, though not able to give him much credit for the manner in which it was announced. Resentment could not have been more plainly spoken than in a civility to her father, from which she was so pointedly excluded. She had not even a share in his opening compliments. Her name was not mentioned, and there was so striking a change in all this, and such an ill-judged solemnity of leave-taking in his graceful acknowledgments, that she thought, at first, could not escape her father's suspicion. It did, however. Her father was quite taken up with the surprise of so sudden a journey, and in his fears that Mr. Elton might never get safely to the end of it, and saw nothing extraordinary in his language. It was a very useful note, for it supplied him with fresh matter for thought and conversation during the rest of their lonely evening. Mr. Woodhouse talked over his alarms, and Emma was in spirits to persuade him away with all her usual promptitude. She now resolved to keep Harriet no longer in the dark. She had reason to believe her nearly recovered from her cold, and it was desirable that she should have as much time as possible for getting the better of her other complaint before the gentleman's return. She went to Mrs. Goddard's accordingly the very next day to undergo the necessary penance of communication, and a severe one it was. She had to destroy all the hopes which she had which he had been so industriously feeding. To appear in ungracious character of the one preferred, and acknowledge herself grossly mistaken and misjudging in all her ideas on one subject, all her observations, all her convictions, all her prophecies for the last 6 weeks. The confession completely renewed her shame, and the sight of Harriet's tears made her think that she should never be in charity with herself again. Harriet bore the intelligence very well, blaming nobody, and in everything testifying such an ingenuousness of disposition and lowly opinion of herself as must appear with particular advantage at that moment to her friend. Emma was in the humor to value simplicity and modesty to the utmost, and all that was amiable, all that ought to be attaching, seemed on Harriet's side, not her own. Harriet did not consider herself as having anything to complain of. The affection of such a man as Mr. Elton would have been too great a distinction. She never could have deserved him, and nobody but so partial and kind a friend as Miss Woodhouse would have thought it possible. Her tears fell abundantly, but her grief was so truly artless that no dignity could have been made more respectable in Emma's eyes, and she listened to her and tried to console her with all her heart and understanding, really for the time convinced that Harriet was the superior creature of the two. And that to resemble her would be more for her own welfare and happiness than all that genius or intelligence could do. It was rather too late in the day to set about being simple-minded and ignorant, but she left her with every previous resolution confirmed of being humble and discreet, and repress in imagination all the rest of her life. Her second duty now, inferior only to her father's claims, was to promote Harriet's comfort and endeavor to prove her own affection in some better method than by matchmaking. She got her to Hartfield and showed her the most unvarying kindness, striving to occupy and amuse her, and by books and conversation to drive Mr. Elton from her thoughts. Time, she knew, must be allowed for this being thoroughly done, and she could compose herself but an indifferent judge of such matters in general, and very inadequate to sympathize in an attachment to Mr. Elton in particular. But it seemed to her reasonable that at Harriet's age, and with the entire extinction of all hope, such a progress might be made towards a state of composure by the time of Mr. Elton's return, as to allow them all to meet again in the common routine of acquaintance without any danger of betraying sentiments or increasing them. Harriet did think him all perfection. Harriet did think him all perfection, and maintained the non-existence of anybody equal to him in person or goodness, and did, in truth, prove herself more resolutely in love than Emma had foreseen. That she could not comprehend, but yet it appeared to her so natural, so inevitable to strive against an inclination of that sort unrequited, that she could not comprehend its continuing very long and equal force. If Mr. Elton, on his return, made his own indifference as evident and indubitable as she could not doubt he would anxiously do, she could not imagine Harriet's persisting to place her happiness in the sight or the recollection of him. Their being fixed, so absolutely fixed in the same place, was bad for each, for all three. Not one of them had the power of removal or of effecting any material change of society. They must encounter each other and make the best of it. Harriet was further unfortunate in the tone of her companions at Mrs. Goddard's, Mr. Elton being the adoration of all the teachers and great girls in the school, and it must be at Hartfield only that she could have any chance of hearing him spoken of with cooling moderation or repellent truth. Where the wound had been given, there must the cure be found, if anywhere. And Emma felt that till she saw her in the way of cure, there could be no true peace for herself. All right, that was from Emma, chapters 16 and 17. So thank you very much for watching that. If you like classic literature, I hope you'll subscribe. We do this most nights of the week. And then when I'm done with this, I cut out all the false starts and make it into an audiobook and then repost it for free. Also, you can check out my Patreon, link in the bio, if you want to support the channel or listen ad-free. So you don't have to listen to the ads on YouTube. It's like $3 a month, and you just listen to everything on there. But anyway, thanks very much for listening, and I will see you tomorrow night.